Okay, let's take a look at inverse functions. Remember, inverse happens when we switch the x and the y because inverse means opposite. So the first little bit here asks us, here's a function or a relationship, and we need to switch these x's and y's to get the new inverse. So it's as easy as flipping the order. 5, negative 13. You notice I took the 5, which was the y, and turned it into the x, and did the opposite with x and switched it to y. The next one doesn't really change because, the negative 9 and the negative 9 don't really flip. But here I'll take the negative 2 and put it in the x spot, and the negative 5 and put it in the y spot. And you can go through and do that really quickly. Just flip all the x's and the y's, and you should create an inverse relation. All of my inputs become outputs. All right, for numbers 1 through 12, you kind of have a choice. You can either solve them algebraically by switching the x and the y and solving, or you can do the grocery list method. I like the list method the best, so I'm going to do that for the video purposes. And remember that once we start writing the answers, they should be the same way that you're solving them algebraically, so you're pretty much doing the same thing here. Okay, what I like to do is I use PEMDAS, or I like to call it GEMDAS, because I like to say grouping symbols instead of just parentheses. So I'm going to refer to it as GEMDAS instead of PEMDAS. We're going to have that listed next to us and help us list what happened to x. We'll make a little list of what happened to x using GEMDAS. So I'll look at this function. Do we have any groups or grouping symbols? We do not. Do we have any exponents? We do not. We do have multiplication though. We took the x and multiplied by 3. So the very first thing we did was we multiplied by 3. And then the next thing we did was subtract 9. So we are going to now write the answer to this. F negative 1, the inverse of the function x, happens when I take x and I do the exact opposite of this list. That means I have to go in the opposite order. So I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up. And I have to do the opposite operation. So I'm going to take that x, and instead of subtracting 9, I'm going to add 9. And then I'm going to take that whole chunk of numbers there. Instead of multiplying by 3, I'm going to divide by 3. Divide is the opposite of multiply. So there we go. We have the inverse of number 1. For number 2, let's make our little list of what happened to x in this new function using GEMDAS. First of all, are there any groups? You might not see any parentheses, but there is a group. This group of numbers is all divided by 4. Since there is a big divide by line, this is technically a group of numbers that we have to deal with before we do any multiplication or division. In other words, since this entire thing is divided by 4, we must first solve or list what is happening above the line before we talk about this divide by 4. So the first thing that happened was we subtracted 5. And again, I'm going to say that subtraction, even though it's the S in GEMDAS and it's after division, I'm going to list that first because technically it's part of a group, which is the very first thing you list. Okay? And then after we subtracted that 5, we divide by 4. So now I'm ready for my answer. F negative 1 of x is going to happen when we take x and we start at the bottom, and instead of dividing by 4, we are going to multiply by 4. And then instead of subtracting 5, we are going to add 5. There is the inverse of number 2. For number 3, let's list what happened to this function. It looks like my exponent must be listed first. So the very first thing I did to x was I squared it. And then I subtracted 9. So I'm going to start at the bottom. I'm going to write my answer. F of x happens when I take x. Instead of subtracting 9, I'm going to add 9. And instead of squaring, I'm going to square root. And make sure you square root the entire thing there. For the next one, if I look at GEMDAS, there are no groups. no parentheses, no division or square roots. So the next thing I'm going to list is the exponent. So I first squared, and then I multiplied by 5. So we're going to do the opposite. So f negative 1 of x happens when I do the opposite. I'm going to start with multiply by 5. So the opposite of multiply by 5 would be divide by 5. And then instead of squaring, I'm going to square root. And make sure you square root the entire thing. The next one, number 5, this is the biggest. This is the biggest and probably the hardest one of the whole worksheet. So we want to make sure we do this really carefully when we make our list. So here's my list here. Again, I'm going to write GEMDAS so that we can make sure we follow right. My order of operations says do the stuff in the grouping symbol first. So we do have a parenthesis or a grouping symbol. What's happening in there to x? Inside of there, we are adding 2. So that's the first thing I'm going to write, add 2. Okay, we took care of the G, the grouping symbols. The next thing, are there any exponents? Oh yeah, there's an exponent right there. So we need to list that next. We squared that x. All right, then is there any multiplication? Did we multiply x? Yes, we did. We multiplied by 5. So that's the next thing we're going to list. Multiply by 5. All right. Is there any division? There's no division, so we're good. There's no addition because remember we already took care of that first addition. So the last one we need to say, is there subtraction? There he is. We subtracted 1 for the very last step. Okay, we're going to now be ready for our answer. So I'm going to write my function inverse notation. And instead of going down, we are going to now follow this list in the opposite order and do the opposite function. So instead of taking x and subtracting 1, we are going to add 1. Instead of multiplying by 5, we are going to divide by 5. Instead of squaring, we are going to square root. And instead of adding 2, we are going to subtract 2. So you can kind of think of it like that. Okay? For the next one, my list, according to GEMDAS, there are no groups. There is an exponent, so we did square that x first. There's also multiplication. We multiplied by 3. Next, there is no division but there is addition. So the last thing we did was we added 8. So I'm ready for my answer. f negative 1 of x happens when I take x, and I'm going to start at the bottom. Instead of adding 8, I subtracted 8. Then instead of multiplying by 3, I divide, and then instead of squaring, I square root. Make sure you square root everything that's written there. For number 7, this one's an easy one. It looks like first I multiplied by 2. Then I subtracted 3. So I'm going to take my answer. It's going to be my x. Instead of subtracting 3, I'm going to add 3. And instead of multiplying by 2, I'm going to divide by 2. Opposite order of the list and opposite operation. All right, this one has a grouping symbol. So just like problem number 2, this is a group of numbers. We have to talk about that group or what happened in this group before we talk about the divide. So the very first thing that happened in that group on the top was we added 4. Then we divide by 3. So we took g negative 1 of x must be that x. Starting at the bottom, instead of dividing by 3, we have to multiply, and instead of adding 4, we have to subtract. There we go. h of x, my GEMDAS list. First, inside the group, we added 7. Again, G stands for grouping symbols. What happens inside that group? We added 7. Then on the outside, we have an exponent, or we squared that group. So we're ready to write our answer. h negative 1 of x happens when we take x. So we start at the bottom. Instead of squaring, we must square root the x. And then we're going to not add 7, but subtract 7. Notice how that subtract 7 is not part of the square root, because first we square rooted and then we subtracted. For number 10, we do have a group here. Group includes anything written inside of a square root sign. So my list would be first, what's happening inside. That is the addition. So we added 2 first. And then after we add the 2, we square rooted. So my v negative 1 of x will happen when I take x and I don't square root, but I square. And then I don't add 2, but I subtract 2. For j, my GEMDAS list. First, so there are no groups. There is an exponent. There I squared the x. Then I also multiplied by 9. And then I added 2. So for my answer, I'm going to take j negative 1 of x. I'm going to take x. I'm going to start at the bottom. Instead of adding 2, I'm going to subtract. Instead of multiplying, I'm going to divide. And instead of squaring, I'm going to square root. There we go. Last but not least, GEMDAS. Here, there is a group. Well, it's within here. What's happening inside of there? I multiplied by 3. Outside of that, I'm square rooting, which technically falls into the exponent category. And then number 3, I subtracted 1. So f of x is going to, or f negative 1 of x is going to happen when I take x, and I'm going to start at the bottom. Instead of square rooting, or I'm sorry, instead of subtracting 1, I'm going to add 1. Instead of square rooting, I'm going to square. Make sure you square everything. So we need to signify that with a parenthesis squared. And then instead of multiplying by 3, I need to divide everything by 3. There's the inverse for 12.